Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this last session of the day. I'm Alexis Mergenoff. I'm a faculty member at NYU's School of Global Public Health. And I'm going to be moderating a really fantastic interdisciplinary panel on one of the key issues related to climate adaptation housing. So the title of our session today is Hazards in Housing, Socio-Ecological Contexts of Displacement, Relocation, and Adaptation. We are incredibly grateful to all of these collaborators who have supported this wonderful symposium that we've had today. It's been truly a heavy lift to make this event happen, but a really important time for this event to occur. So thank you to all of our collaborators. So just to get everybody oriented, I'm sure many of you have, attended some sessions earlier in the day, but just in case, because this is a different platform than many of us are used to, you can see down at the bottom that you have some widgets available. You can use these to minimize or maximize different windows that are available to you. The really important one for us, especially towards the end of our session, is for you guys to use the Q&A icon. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in. I will keep track of them, and we will try to address as many as possible at the end of the session. You can also view you can also view abstracts using that icon that looks like a page for any of the presentations that you hear today. Or if you have any tech issues, we have some help available for that as well. Okay, so let's dive into our group of presenters today. We have Justin Schon from University of Florida, Carolien Kraan from University of Miami, Carlos Martín from the Urban Institute, and Rachel Meltzer from the New School. So what we're going to do is go through, each presenter is going to have about 16 to 18 minutes to present. We're going to hold addressing any questions that come up until the end, but please feel free to type away in the Q&A box as they come up. So let's start off with Justin Schon, who's a postdoctoral researcher at University of Florida. And he is going to present on water, violence, and internal displacement, evidence from Somalia, 2007-2018.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexis, for running this panel. If I get any of this tech wrong, my apologies. Let's see, wait. Okay. This work is a collaboration between myself, Paulina Concha-Lurari, and Manu Lau. And by the way, I have recently moved to the Department of Politics at the University of Virginia. So that happened over the summer, which is why I think not everything in the program caught that. But so the paper that I'm going to be presenting here today is currently under review. So I am happy to share the paper with anyone who reaches out and is interested. That will be a place to go to dive into some of the details of some of the modeling data and other kinds of nitty-gritty choices that we made in the analysis. So to kind of start with the research question that we have here, we recognize that there's not a whole lot of consensus right now broadly on climate conflict migration links. There's kind of one viewpoint that as climate change progresses, that conflict and migration are just going to intensify, and people tell a variety of doomsday scenarios out of these things. I think that that kind of scenario needs to have much more nuance added on top of it. Climate could very well be a threat multiplier, as it's commonly referred to, but even if it is, responses to threat are extremely complex, and so it still remains to really be understood whether this threat is met with responses of migration and displacement, violence, or a variety of other kinds of responses. We chose to focus specifically in this paper on how water fluctuations, either surplus or deficit, affect conflict and migration. And our expectations here are that people generally leave high violence locations and move toward low violence locations, generally something that kind of makes sense. And then on top of that, we have kind of a general expectation that water anomalies, both high and low, increase violence and displacement. Going into this work, it was not clear how exactly this full combination of water, violence, and displacement links operate. Now, we analyzed this question specifically within the context of Somalia from 2007 through 2018, a time period that kind of has three somewhat distinct phases within it. The first being one of very intense conflict, roughly from 2007 through 2012, where Somalia is embroiled in an intense civil war. You have Al-Shabaab arguably at kind of the peak of its power, and you're kind of at the peak of competition for control over the capital of Mogadishu, and then transitioning into a period of relative calm, the word relative being very important here, because during this 2013 to 2015 time period, levels of violence and displacement were quite low by Somali standards, but for a lot of other countries, they would still be considered quite high. Then come this 2016 to 2018 time period, we see a kind of growing period of insurgency and environmental threat combining. And so you can kind of think about Somalia presenting a context during this 2007 to 2012 period as primarily occupying civilians with considerations of violent threat, and then 2016 to 2018 primarily occupying civilians with kind of both violent and environmental threat. Now, the research design that we use here focuses on 3 regions within Somalia rather than the entire country. So we do exclude Somaliland and Puntland in the north that have some distinct dynamics of their own. And our choice here of Banadir, Lower Shabelle, and Haran allows us to capture some variation across urban and rural areas, as well as focus on dynamics along the Shabelle River, where we can disaggregate fluctuations in water into fluctuations in precipitation and fluctuations in surface water, so that we don't make what could be the mistake of over aggregating water fluctuations into one thing. Now, the data that we use for this analysis is monthly data coming from several different sources. The first being region to region internal displacement flow data from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees that works with the Norwegian Refugee Council to gather this data. We have fatalities data from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, and then surface water data, which is measured by this organization's SWALIM, we use data specifically from the Belet-Wain and Jauhar monitoring points. The data from the Belet-Wain monitoring point we use for Iran, and the Jauhar monitoring point data we use for the Lower Shabelle region. For precipitation data, we use the CHIRPS data set. And you can see some examples of our raw time series for fatalities, IDP inflows, and IDP outflows for the Benadir region at the bottom of this slide. I should note here that for the majority of the analysis that we use a cumulative sums technique to identify anomalies in these violence, displacement, and water variables. I can also show here for Lower Shabelle and Hiran what these fatalities and IDP flow variables look like. Thinking about the water variables, we can see in the two plots on the left, the surface water measurements along the Shabelle River. We have a much longer time series for our water variables than for our violence and displacement variables. The longer time series here were helpful for identifying our high and low anomalies here. If it was possible for us to have longer time series of violence and displacement, we would certainly use those as well. And then on the right-hand side here, we have our time series for precipitation. The specific time series analysis method that we use is referred to as wavelet analysis. This is particularly useful for analyzing time series that do not have constant mean and variance over time. I make this note because a lot of time series methods that we tend to use do make this assumption or require us to use various techniques to transform our time series to make them have these properties. And so we instead think that it may be helpful to not have to transform our data in order to do this analysis. Within wavelet analysis, we can use wavelet transforms to analyze patterns of seasonality and coherence tests in order to examine correlations and delayed responses between the time series. Now, rather than diving into the full complexity and nuance of results, I'm going to give you the headline here, which are that the violence migration links generally operate as expected. So, internal displacement is happening away from high violence areas and towards low violence areas. Interestingly here, when it comes to water, it is flood or abnormally high levels of precipitation and surface water that tend to precede internal displacement and be correlated with it, and not drought. This is an important distinction to make, given some of the assumptions that have been made, in particular about the 2011 drought that happened in Somalia. There's been a great deal of discussion about this, and yet we really don't see a clear correlation between that particular drought and resultant internal displacement. Now, one caveat that we make here from the analysis that we did is that if drought is related to displacement, then it seems to have about a 1 year delayed response between the drought and when the internal displacement actually takes place. Going forward, we think that that's a really important thing to highlight. Now, to wrap this up a bit more, we want to highlight here that during intense conflict, so thinking about the 2007 to 2012 time period when civil war was the primary concern, water fluctuations were really not relevant for violence or internal displacement. Again, here we're emphasizing that it's these high water levels rather than low water levels that seem most likely to increase displacement. And while this is being observed, we also want to note that climate factors do not disrupt violence migration links, and that if anything, they add on top of them. So in conclusion here, we can come away with these larger statements that climate fluctuations may only matter for violence and internal displacement when intense conflict does not already exist. Different kinds of climate factors have different effects. And it's very important to disaggregate water into precipitation, surface water, and groundwater. In our particular case, we were not able to obtain groundwater data for Somalia, but that's certainly a direction that we're moving towards. And finally here, thinking specifically about this high-profile event of drought in 2011 in Somalia, we would argue that that event needs to be re-examined. And while we're doing that, the major flooding that was taking place in 2019 in Somalia is likely much more of a spark for internal displacement than that previous drought had been. Thank you very much, and I will look forward to any and all questions and comments.
Great, thank you so much, Justin. Really interesting presentation. For those of you who may have joined us a little late, I just want to remind you to please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the page. If any questions come up throughout any of the presentations, please feel free to type them in there, and then we will address them at the end of our 4 presentations. Okay, so next up, we have Carolien Kraan. Carolien is a PhD researcher at University of Miami. And she's going to talk to us on relocation outcomes for participants in U.S. property buyouts, a nationwide analysis. Thanks, Carolien. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Alexis. I'm really excited to be part of this panel here on hazardous and housing. And I'll now take us from Somalia back to the United States, where I guess most of us are located at this moment. So for this presentation, I would like to share with you results or like ongoing research that I'm currently working on. And for that, so I don't have a ton of results to share with you, but I do really want to share with you some background on this and also then some steps of how I am doing this research. So my research focuses on relocation outcomes for U.S. property buyouts for participants in those buyout programs. And before I dive into how I find these relocations and also how I analyze these relocation outcomes, I'll first want to give you some background on this. So voluntary property buyout programs in the United States have mostly taken place in the case of flooding, where flood risk was most important. And so if we think about managing flood risk, there are basically 3 main steps that we can do in order to mitigate this flood risk. On the one hand, we can protect. So that means we can build things like seawalls or levees in order to make sure that the floodwaters don't actually get to the neighborhoods where people live, and therefore we keep those people safe and avoid damages to those structures. We can also accommodate, which means that we allow the floodwaters to come into neighborhoods, but then we have made sure that the structures that are located there are actually able to deal with it better. So an example for that would be elevation, or other examples would be making sure that electricity lines are high enough so that if the lower level of your home floods, the electricity doesn't immediately cut out. And then the last thing we can do in order to manage flood risk, or the last category of actions we can take, is retreat. Now on the one hand, there's unmanaged retreat, where people either decide or are forced to move away from locations of high flood risk without any external help coming in. And then there's also managed retreat, where there's support for people moving away from those high flood risk areas. And voluntary property buyout programs are one form of managed retreat. And it's actually the form that is the longest running and also the largest form that has taken place in the United States. So what does a buyout look like? Well, this is an example of what buyouts could look like in one neighborhood. On the left-hand side, you see a neighborhood before buyouts have taken place there, and on the right-hand side, the same neighborhood with buyouts after the buyouts have taken place. So what we see here is there's a creek, obviously, or at least a waterway in the top right corner of our image. And in the before picture, we see a vibrant neighborhood. We see lots of houses located there. And in the after situation, we see a lot less houses. So the way voluntary property buyout programs work is they give homeowners the opportunity to move away from a home that is very flood prone, that they might not be able to sell on the market, and then they are able to relocate, take their money basically, and are able to relocate to a location that is safer. Those buyout programs are usually organized at a local level by local governments, although funding is often not just from those local governments, but also from state governments and federal governments. And so one very main funder at the federal level for this would be the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. They usually fund buyouts in post-disaster context. So if a disaster has taken place in a location and the president has declared that disaster a federally declared disaster, money becomes available for hazard mitigation activities, of which buyouts are one option. And then local governments are able to use that money in order to organize those buyout programs. So if we zoom out from this one neighborhood to the nationwide level, this is basically what that looks like. So FEMA has organized buyouts since 1989, and over those last 30 years, approximately 40,000 households have had the opportunity to move away from their flood-prone home to a different location. In this map, what you can see is dots for every county where a buyout has taken place. And so buyouts have taken place in 49 out of the 50 states. They have taken place in about 1,000 different counties. So that means almost a third of local jurisdictions actually have experience with buyouts. But we also see that most of those buyouts actually are pretty small scale. We see that a lot of these dots are between 1 and 10, their smallest size. And there's only about 100 places where more than 100 buyouts have taken place. So buyouts at a somewhat larger scale, more like the image I just showed you in the previous slide. Now, why do I think it's important to study the relocation of where those people are heading to? Well, if we look into the future, we expect flood risk to increase. Obviously, most of you have heard probably about sea level rise and things like increasing extreme weather events, increasing precipitation and changing precipitation patterns. But if we just look at this graph at first, this is work by Hauer et al., and they looked at people that might be in locations that will be permanently inundated in 2100. So their graph indicates that depending on the amount of sea level rise, we'll see between 4 and about 13 million people that will be living in locations that are not just flood prone, but that are actually permanently inundated. So those people will not be able to live there unless we do something about that. Obviously, as I just explained to you, there's these 3 categories of actions we can take. Historically, protection has been sort of a favorite and like the default action to revert to, especially in locations with high property values and high population densities. But in 2018, the National Climate Assessment, for the first time, actually stated that retreat will now become unavoidable. There will be places where this inundation will be taking place and where we are not going to be able to protect those people using either protection or accommodation. And so therefore, I think it's very likely that retreat, and specifically managed retreat through buyout programs, is going to be likely into the future, potentially even at larger scales than we've seen before. This is a policy that already exists. We have experience with it. There is political willingness to do buyouts, not in every location, but definitely certain jurisdictions. And so I think it's very important that we study how people have been affected by these buyout programs in order to make sure that when they take place in the future, as they likely will be, we'll make that the outcomes for these people will actually be as positive as can be, and we will reduce the amount of negative impacts that people might feel. So first step in actually getting to this question is therefore asking ourselves, where do those residents relocate to? At this point in time, this is actually information we don't currently have. We barely know where those buyouts have taken place. FEMA has some information, but other government agencies, such as either local governments when they fund buyouts or the Department of Housing and Urban Development, we don't even know where those buyouts have taken place. And so even though this might seem like a very basic question, I do think it's one of the questions that we do need to answer before we're actually going to be able to get to improving this buyout program. Now, there have been two research groups that have looked at this question before. Devin McGee has looked into the Staten Island buyouts that took place after Hurricane Sandy hit in 2012. And she has looked into about 300 households and where they moved over there. There's also another research group led by Kevin Loughran, and he has looked into Houston and where people move there. They have both looked into a couple hundred households and manually used public records in order to indicate, or in order to track where those people went to after their buyouts. And what we've learned from that is that in many cases, people have moved relatively short distances. From the work by Devin McGee, we've also learned that in many cases, people actually move to places that might be more vulnerable to flooding or other hazards. And from the work by Kevin Loughran, we have learned that in some cases, what might have been happening is that people have moved, white homeowners have actually moved from neighborhoods that are relatively well integrated racially to neighborhoods that were are then mostly white. And so there's definitely some concerns about equity and about outcomes that we have, also based on other case studies of people that have been followed post-buyouts. But I'm trying to answer this question at a larger scale. And so I'm doing this using more data. Here I have a flow diagram of approximately how I'm trying to do this data, to do this research. The first step over here was to do a Freedom of Information Act request at FEMA in order to be able to actually gain the information that I needed, gain the buyouts. I think something's going wrong a little bit with my slides right now. For me, they seem to be not at the right slide, but I'll get back to the slide where I think I need to be at. Okay, so FEMA has been able to grant me the information that I needed, actually in the actual individual addresses of where buyouts have taken place. I also have access to another data set by CoreLogic. This is a data set with public information about property deed transactions. And so this data set is the most comprehensive nationwide data set, that exists, and that goes back decades in some cases. What I didn't do is I tried to find those addresses that I've received from FEMA in this larger property deed transaction data set to see if I can find the deed transactions that describe the buyout. These deed transactions then here at number 2 will then give me some key information, namely the seller name of the person who sold it. And then using this information, this seller name, I then go back into this property deed information, this property data set, in order to see whether I can find whether that same person has bought a property elsewhere and therefore know where this person is going to be moving. Now, this seems like a fairly straightforward process. Obviously, like any research in practice, it's a lot harder than this. But basically, the first step here would be for me to actually find the buyout deeds using that buyout address that I've received from FEMA. So the first thing I need to do is find a way to match the buyout to, or the address that I've received for the buyout to the address in CoreLogic. There's a lot of data cleaning that needed to happen over there, and so I started with about 35,000 data sets, or 35,000 addresses, and eventually I was able, through cleaning, to clean properly about 31,000 of them. In some cases, the address, unfortunately, didn't actually give me information that I can look up, but sometimes the address would refer to things like the property next to the church on Main Street, which obviously is an address that makes it very hard for me to find where that is. Then the second step for me was to see whether, once I have actually been able to find multiple transactions for a location, to see whether I can exclude those transactions to buyout. I do this, for example, looking at the time. If I have a property sale that takes place in 1998, but I know that the buyout funding was not granted until 2005, I know that this is probably not a buyout, but just a sale of a property from one person to another person. I also can look at other things, other characteristics of the deed transaction to see whether I can exclude it as a buyout. If the person buying the property is another individual and the property is just sold from person A to person B, this is also not likely to be a buyout, because we know that buyout programs are run by government agencies or sometimes land conservation groups, organizations, but never really by individuals. So there's ways for us to exclude things as buyouts. But at the end of the day, it's very hard to, with 100% confidence for all the records that we have, to say whether they're a buyout. So I have two levels of confidence that I then want to include. On the one hand, I want to include some level of confidence to see whether or not the deed transaction that I have, that gives me the information of the sale, actually describes a buyout. And one way, for example, for me to do that is to compare the sale price that is available in CoreLogic with the sale price that's available through the FEMA data set. And if these sale prices are very close together, I have more confidence that this is actually the buyout. And if they're if they're like very far apart, I have less confidence in this. And then next to this, I also want to see, I also want to indicate my confidence about whether or not I think the homeowner or the property owner is actually someone who's going to be relocating. For example, FEMA indicates whether or not properties are vacant land or whether properties are rental properties. And of course, if there's a rental property, the property owner is the one that is going to be selling the property. But on the other hand, the resident, the tenant, is going to be the one that has to move. And so I'm not really interested in that case in looking at the property owner. I'm more interested in the resident, which will not be possible for me actually in this case. And through this work, I've actually found that about 4,500 buyouts were involved people that were either renting the home or mobile homeowners, in which case they usually rent the lot that they're on. And so those people are very hard to track because it's notoriously hard to track renters. And it's also renters and mobile homeowners are also usually groups that are more vulnerable. And so it definitely warrants more research. But unfortunately, it's unlikely that those people are going to be buyers of properties after the buyout. And so unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to find results for them. Then there's a second method that I use. So this is the first method that I used. I had addresses from FEMA and I looked those up. And then from FEMA, I also received through another Freedom of Information Act request, a data set that didn't have the addresses for buyouts, but it had zip codes and city names. And then it also included the names of people involved with the buyout. So the names of the people to whom basically the check was written when the buyout was finalized. And so I also used this information to then look for, to see if I could find more buyouts. So in this case, I wouldn't look for the address. I would look for the name of the property owner within the state that I knew the buyout had taken place. And then I went through the same steps. So I wanted to see whether I could exclude any transactions that I could find for that person's name, whether I could exclude any of them as buyouts. And then when I couldn't exclude them anymore, I wanted to see how confident I felt about this. So in this case, my confidence, for example, would be going up if the zip codes would be exactly the same. And if the zip codes were wildly off, I would not be so confident about them. And also here, there's some confidence here also for the seller, whether or not it's a relocating homeowner, not only because of the vacant land or the rental issue, but also, for example, if the person or the entity selling the property was, for example, a company, because obviously it's interesting to see where companies go, but my research here focuses more on residential relocations. And so based on these two methods, I've now been able to track in total almost 10,000, or I've now been able to find the buyout deed transactions for almost 10,000 buyouts. So again, my data set started with about 30,000 and I have about 10,000 left of them. about 5,800 came from that first method, where I used the addresses, and about 6,800 from the second method, where I used the names. There were about slightly more than 3,000 where I had overlap, so those were buyouts, detransactions that I was able to find through both of those methods. But then uniquely from the addresses, I was able to find 2,700, and then uniquely from the names, I was able to find 3,700 buyout detransactions. And so in total, I now have about 9,500. So this is the first step of my research. And my first step was really to find those buyout detransactions and then have the names specifically for those people and have like information about the buyout detransaction, like when this buyout took place, how much the house was sold for, what type of property was sold. And this is then the information that I want to take into my next step, which is then finding the relocation addresses. So for this next step, I start within the state where the buyout took place, and then I look for any other buyout or any other detransactions that, or any other sales or purchases that were done by the same name, by the same homeowner. Again, over here, I'm trying to see whether I can exclude any transactions as a relocation. So if I can find, for example, well, I'm blanking on it right now. I'll come back to it later. So first I start within the state. I'm going to try to see if I can exclude any as a relocation. So for example, if I can find a purchase that was before the buyout took place, this was probably not the location where the people moved to, especially not if it's years before the buyout took place. And then also indicate the confidence that I think this detransaction then indicates the relocation address. And here the confidence, for example, is mostly, I have very little information to go off. I have the name of the person and obviously the information where they lived before and some information about the property where they lived before. And so I can use some confidence over here to say, based on the knowledge that we have that a lot of people actually stay nearby when they move, I can, for example, find if I have a person that is John Smith, and I find a John Smith that moves within the same county, but also a John Smith that moves to a different part of the state. I can say there's probably more likely the John Smith that remains close by is the John Smith that I'm looking for. I can also use things like the sale price of the buyout property and the sale price of the new property. If they are approximately the same, that's likely. If someone sold a home for about $100K and then buys a new home for $1 million, maybe that's less likely to happen. I do this in the state initially in order to, again, because I have very little information to go off, I only have the names of the property owners. And so I do this in the state initially in order to reduce the number of false positives that I find. There's lots of John Smiths all over the US, and so it might be hard for me to tell them apart if I look for them in all the different states. And then once I actually have all this information, that's when the real analysis is going to start. So that's where I'm really going to look into outcomes. And basically my outcomes will be focused on two different things. On the one hand, I want to look at household level impact. So really what impact did this have on people? Were people able to find another home fairly quickly? Were people able to find a similar home? Or do we see that people are downsizing or moving to neighborhoods that are differently? And the second thing is moving into neighborhood level changes. So here I'm going to try to see whether people move into neighborhoods that are comparable to the neighborhoods that they lived in. Do we see that people are having to move to neighborhoods with sort of school districts maybe that might be a little bit worse, or neighborhoods that are have more crime, things like that. And so this is all ongoing research, and I'm hoping to have a chance in the future to actually present on the results to all of you. But I'm going to leave it here for now, just thanking my fellow co-authors and fellow researchers on this program. So back to you, Alexis.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That is a tremendous effort to create a really important data set. And I have so many questions, but we will hold them until the end. Fantastic. Okay, so we're going to move on now to Carlos Martín. Carlos is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, and his presentation is titled Housing Adaptation, Behaviors and Resources in Post-Katrina Greater New Orleans. Take it away, Carlos.
All right, thank you so much, Alexis, and thank you to all the panelists. As Alexis mentioned, I'm a senior researcher at the Urban Institute, and I'm actually a housing researcher. I'm a houser by training, and let me see. And my area of focus is primarily physical quality of housing and the policies and tools for their equitable improvement. So it gives me great pleasure to be on a housing panel because I also want to remind folks that so much of in the climate adaptation space, so much of the work that we do in terms of exposure and risk and vulnerability is based on housing location. And in the United States, at least, that also is overlaid by the fact that we have historical racial segregation and services disparities. So housing has always been a critical issue for me, and certainly one that I think is going to be a key issue for the field as we move forward. So the data I'm presenting today are from a study begun in 2016 with funding from the National Academies of Sciences Gulf Research Program under the Thriving Communities Grants Program. And Urban began looking at potential climate-related risks to housing and households' housing decisions through tools, particularly information and housing practice tools, and with the hypothesis that they were not being equally available to everyone. So our focus in the study, in the overall study, has been 5 specific areas in housing tools, if you will. First is property and hazard insurance. Second is information and property disclosures. Third are incentives for physical mitigation. And by mitigation, I mean structural mitigation at the household level. So everything from storm shutter installation all the way through elevation. Fourth, the actual risk in relationship to community-wide public works that protect the residences. And then fifth is household participation in that infrastructure planning or that urban planning that has some effect on communities and, the housing within them. So our focus has been on the New Orleans area, and we picked New Orleans particularly because of the likelihood of increased awareness at the household level of housing risks in the post-Katrina world. So given the acute awareness of household level risk and the complex policy scenario in which there has been a massive investment in infusion of federal funding, particularly for mitigation, but combined with a very conservative government that may not be allocating that funding from internal resources. So the key takeaways I want you to think about after we're done with this presentation are that there actually is general awareness about climate-related risks, particularly outside of the flood zones in the New Orleans area. But there are gaps that persist in information sources and interpretation of that information compared to the actual risk in these communities, which poses the third point that there are opportunities in the housing transaction institutions to build consumer awareness. So to answer some of the questions in our study, we designed a survey in 7 parishes in Greater New Orleans to explore these disparities in climate risks. The populations of interest were post-Katrina home buyers. I'm trying to see if the slide is moving forward, and it doesn't seem to be moving forward. There it goes. Sorry about that. There's a delayed reaction on my end. All right, the post-Katrina home buyers, so 2008 and on to the present, stratified first by flood zone location. So why are we looking at home buyers rather than everybody in the population? One is because home buyers within the last 10 to 12 years are more likely to have ready information about the disclosures they were given in the home purchase, and also be more knowledgeable about their insurance policies. It's important to note that it's a concern that we have to exclude renters from that sample, from that population, but it's also because the state of Louisiana requires no disclosure of risk information beyond federal lead-based paint rules. So, the focus on the home buyers within this time frame made a little more sense for the types of questions we were asking. We designed the survey as a multi-mode survey to grant people choice in their preferred response method, and we actually fielded the survey over a 1-year period. We even had a hotline for questions, et cetera, that people could call or text. So ultimately, given all that level of effort for fielding the survey, we had a representative sample of 952 respondents. The survey is 70 questions long and asks questions on 5 topics that you'll see on the right. Information about the home, such as purchase price and location considerations. Second, questions about the homeowner's risk perception, such as whether risk of floods or other related hazards affect their home buying decisions. Third, very detailed questions about homeowners' insurance policies, including premiums and claims and deductibles and overall coverage. And fourth, questions about whether they have taken actions to prevent any future risks, such as elevating the home or installing storm shutters. Fifth, we also ask demographic information, such as race and income, et cetera. So the data I'm going to be showing are very clean, raw, fresh data. We just finished cleaning about 2 weeks ago. So there isn't any significant analysis that we've done at this point. However, I will be presenting some crosstabs that I found particularly relevant for this discussion. And again, this data has not been weighted. And so some of the descriptive frequencies I want to share right now are potential factors that we will use for weighting. About 1/3 of the respondents to our survey were in the flood zone. So that maps out onto the overall population and the overall population of home buyers in the region. And the crosstabs you'll see today, I'm going to be focusing on this specific factor, being in or outside of the flood zone. Now, two demographic factors that we're clearly not representative of the overall population in the New Orleans area are income and race. Income, we have a disproportionate share of very wealthy households that respond to the survey, making over $90,000 annually. The racial composition, 3/4 of our respondents were white, with 50% being African-American, Black. So we will be weighting based on these factors, but this is a clear sign of the kind of home buyers. There have been so many studies on the post-Katrina demographic changes in New Orleans that I'd be happy to provide some references for anybody who wants to see that. So it's not that much of a surprise that those racial and income differences are reflected in our survey responses. Now, this last slide on the bottom left is not a weighting factor, but I did want to share this raw data component because I think it's going to foretell some of the other crosstabs that we're looking at. It's around beliefs of climate change, that climate change is affecting, influencing hazards in the greater New Orleans area. So 55.5% of the population in our responses said that it is. But that also shows that about 26% are reporting maybe or unsure that climate change has an effect, and 18% have said no, that climate change is not affecting their work. So I'm only going to focus on 2 of those areas, topical areas in our survey, just for time's sake. The first is on homeownership decisions and home selection. Now, we modeled the questionnaire in our instrument around traditional questions around home buying decisions, reasons for selecting a specific home, location, as well as a specific home in question. So the first slide I want to review is looking at just one of the reasons that we proposed for respondents to select as being a major, minor, or not a reason in their selection process at all. And that was around flood zone location. So the good news is that a major reason for buying outside of a flood zone was the flood zone location. 52% of the respondents who lived outside of the flood zone said it was a major reason in their home selection process. So that means that there's a level of information conveyance, and that is dissuading people from purchasing certain kinds of properties. The bad news, of course, is that about 21% of those that are at risk are saying that location was not a reason on their selection. So they don't believe that the flood zone is going to be an issue, or they potentially weren't given the information in their decision-making process, or they misunderstood it, or they actually have done some mitigation around their household to make it more feasible and tenable for them to live within the flood zone. So, but there is still that population. A very curious population that I want to point out are those that felt that flood zone was a major reason in their selection process, but they still chose to live in a flood zone. Of that population, we're talking about 21% of those who live in the flood zone population said flood zone status was an important selection criteria in their decision making. Now, flood zone ranked only as 5th out of 8 major reasons of home location choice. So this mirrors many of the past questionnaires and surveys around homeowner choices. Number 1 was affordability, with 64% of respondents reporting that as a major reason. going down to the flood zone. Second was level of crime or violence. Third, look and amenities of a neighborhood. And fourth was proximity to family and friends. Now, this same kind of finding that there's a conscious group of home buyers who are making decisions based on their risks was mirrored in when we asked another question later on in the survey instrument around a related topic such as risk of hurricanes when choosing their homes. And here, 85% of those who lived outside of the flood zone said that some or a large extent was the reason why they chose their home, whereas, and even those who lived in the flood zone said 78%. There was 78% of those respondents said some or a great extent was a consideration when they were purchasing their homes. So to ask questions around whether if there had been a hypothetical set of information that they had been provided to help make them select their homes, we couldn't do that. And so we wanted to ask if there were new information, would they make a selection to move out of their selected home? And not surprisingly, there was a wide range, but not and many folks noting that it was very likely or even somewhat likely. 31% of those that lived that did not live in the flood zone stated that they were somewhat likely or very likely to move based on new information about the risks of their home. 24% of those that lived in the household in the flood zone reported that they were somewhat likely or very likely. So it's a small percentage, but this sentiment was repeated by many of our local research partners, who I'd like to give a shout out to: the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center, now the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, the Data Center in New Orleans, and the Louisiana Language Access. So they've been sounding boards for us about some of the preliminary research findings, and they said this is not a surprise, since given the sunken costs and the life commitments that are made once the home is purchased. The next area that I want to talk about are risk perception and information and perception. And Louisiana, this is a particularly interesting issue post-Katrina, because Louisiana has been a leader in efforts to improve seller hazard disclosures since it revamped its regulations after Hurricane Katrina. Louisiana requires sellers to disclose details related to the nature and frequency of flooding, flood insurance requirements, past repairs, including elevation, details regarding the type and amount of federal disaster aid that previous owners received, as well as a variety of other related flood and hazard related disclosure statements. As a side note, I did want to note that we, as part of this broader study, we did examine home purchases in Orleans Parish in particular to see if there was a change in the share of homes that were purchased in the flood zone versus those that were purchased outside of the flood zone, as the disclosure laws were advanced in 2008, 2013, and 2018. Our analysis actually showed that home purchase rates for homes inside does not show there was not a decrease in the share of homes in the flood zones that one might expect to follow stricter disclosure requirements. In fact, it was a fairly steady level of home purchases inside the flood zone at about 16% throughout this time. And after the most significant disclosure change in 2013, the number and share of homes purchased inside the flood zone actually went up to 19%. So this caused a lot of concern for us, right? So in addition to individual perceptions about climate-related risk, we're curious about sort of the role of information and information sources in making change in decision-making among home buyers. So we asked questions about the content in which they were informed. What is it that relates to the specific property disclosure laws in Louisiana, but also additional disclosure requirements that one might assume were transacted during the home purchase process? Three interesting points here. So on the good, another bit of good news that both in and out of the flood zone, folks were given and reported being given information about the flood zone status. That was about 90%. That's that peak you see in the middle. 90% of both in and out of flood zone reported that they knew what their flood zone status was. What's interesting about that is that that simple metric, as flawed as we know the FEMA flood maps are and the FEMA flood designations are, that kind of simple metric is important. It's become lingua franca for the home transaction industry. So that's something to be conscious of. Second, another important point was that many of the required components of disclosure that one would assume should also be close to 90, 100%, actually range around the halfway mark. For example, people were not necessarily informed, or they were informed and forgot about the flood repair risk, about previous flood damage, et cetera. Third point, you will notice that in almost every category, folks in flood zones have a slightly higher proportion of being informed compared to their non-flood zone counterparts. So this suggests that they are still electing to live in flood zones despite being more informed, or at least recalling that they had been more informed. Another question that we wanted to know about in terms of information and risk perception was about the sources of information when they were doing the home transaction process. So the first column is actually disclosure from the seller, which by law we would also assume should be at 100% because it's a requirement. But the highest source of for information around home risk actually came from inspection reports. So see, these are the private transactions that one home buyer may solicit prior to closing. So 80% of folks in both in and out of the flood zone reported that inspectors were the highest source of information. So agents and seller disclosure, those two on the far left, came in at about 60% for both of the populations. This is particularly concerning since there are no set standards for private building inspectors to denote construction risk to climate-related conditions. So all they have to report is current quality in construction and structure. So since home purchase inspectors are working for the buyer and presumably independent of lenders and realtors, inspectors may be yet another missing link in that information supply chain to convey to home buyers. On a side note, after the purchase, so in the current status of the home buyers that responded to our survey, the source of information changes dramatically, where inspectors as a source of information goes down to 44%, which makes sense because they no longer solicit the services of the inspector. Real estate agents go down to 25%. And the two primary sources of information are local media and state or national government. So another interesting piece on the information and perception side is around interpretation. So one of the ways we sought to ask this is about future risk as the home buyers perceived it. Unfortunately, this slide is incorrect, and I have to apologize for that as it was being transmitted. The wrong chart was put up here. So let me walk you through what this slide actually says. The question is correct. What is the likelihood that a flood will cause major damage to your home in the next 10 years? 24% of buyers that lived in the flood zone reported that a flood causing major damage was somewhat or very likely, whereas those outside of the flood zone reported much lower. 16% of them reported that there was likelihood to be damage from a major storm in 10 years. So most respondents, regardless of flood zone, believe that this event was unlikely in the next 10 years. So there is some displacement of risk at a later time, because another question that we asked was whether there would be a major natural hazard in their community at some point in their lifetime. And 80% of respondents reported affirmatively to that, regardless of those two, regardless of their flood zone location. So there's also displacement of risk, not just by time, but to others. For example, 18.5% of all respondents believe that damage to their home is somewhat or very likely. So that's when you sum up both of those two. But over 28% said damage was likely to their neighbors in that time frame. And almost 62% believe that there would be disruption to basic services. So basically there's a little bit of that punting for later time, assuming the risk is coming later and coming to other people. So I do want to repeat that I didn't cover the insurance and mitigation actions in this discussion, nor did I talk about disparities by other factors beyond being in and out of the flood zone, certainly race and income, as well as a variety of other factors, including housing costs, average sales price of the neighborhood, are going to be continuing factors that we will do analysis on. But certainly we want to point out to the fact that there are institutional changes that have to occur in the home building process that are already being surfaced just in the raw data that we've collected. So I invite you to stay tuned. The final reports, as they come out this year, are going to be published, not just for the survey, but also for the components of the study at this website that you see. And that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Carlos. I really enjoyed that as a researcher who works in New Orleans as well. So fantastic work. Great. Okay, now we're going to move on to Rachel Meltzer. Rachel is an associate professor of urban policy at the New School, and she's going to present on heterogeneity and the recovery of local real estate markets after extreme events, the case of Hurricane Sandy. Go ahead, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I am going to be presenting some research that is joint with colleagues at NYU and now Moody's Analytics, Ingrid Ellen and Xiaodi Li. This is very much a work in progress, so looking forward to feedback and discussion. And I've already learned a ton from the papers that have come before me, and you'll see they tie in nicely to the work that we're doing. So this paper is part of a larger project where we're trying to understand how extreme events impact dense urban settings, which is increasingly happening here in the US. And we already see that hurricane winds, flooding, impacts from these events are costing over $54 billion in losses each year, a good amount of which comes from the loss or damage to real estate assets, which is what I'm going to be looking at today. And the overarching frame is this idea that we have these global shocks, events that cover larger scales, but they can have quite localized economic impacts. And to come up with effective solutions and strategies, we really need to understand this heterogeneity at a very localized level. And so this is what we're trying to tease out here in our analysis. So we're looking at Superstorm Sandy as our case, and in New York City. The storm hit New York City at the end of October in 2012, and it was a big storm that impacted about over 500,000 residents. People died from this storm, almost $19 billion in damage to the city alone. And again, important for what we're trying to understand, this storm had very uneven impacts on the ground. So you had neighborhoods, blocks even, that were very close to one another and experienced very different kinds of flooding and impacts from the storm. And we're gonna exploit that in this analysis to understand what's happening at the very localized level. So we're not the first to look at this, and certainly not in New York City in the context of Hurricane Sandy. Studies so far have found, not surprisingly, that after Hurricane Sandy, there was a reduction in prices of properties that were directly damaged or located inside designated flood zones. And a lot of these studies came out of their findings interpreting these discounts as some capitalization of risk after the effects from this kind of event were made more salient. You'll see our results confirm that, but we go a little further in a few ways. So we're looking over a longer time period than what's been done before, and this lets us look at the impacts several years out from Sandy, as well as it lets us kind of confirm our research design and the way to make sure that the areas we're comparing are kind of comparable leading up to the storm. We're also going to drill down much more than other comparable studies. We're going to disaggregate the effects at a pretty localized neighborhood level. And then we're also going to look at shifts in the response on the part of home buyers to see if there's some change in the composition of those buyers after a price response in these neighborhoods. So the frame that we're working in is the idea that the hurricane comes in, a storm like this, and generates two exogenous shocks to these localized real estate markets. There's going to be a physical damage that's incurred from the storm, but there's also going to be some introduction of possibly new information about risk that wasn't there before. And some of this information about risk can actually be conveyed through that physical damage, which is what makes it tricky to disentangle disentangle this stuff, but we know that there's these two mechanisms at play. And we also think that since we're interested in these kind of sub-market localized effects, that any impact or manifestation through those mechanisms I just described is also going to be mediated by certain features and characteristics inherent to the neighborhoods themselves. So a little bit more on the way we expect this heterogeneity to manifest itself. So information about risk. We think this is going to vary depending on where these properties are located, and again, how much new information this storm brings about their risk to flooding. And the way we're going to operationalize this, which is kind of similar to the presentation just before, is we're going to look at outcomes inside and outside of the flood zone, the designated flood zone. Here, we're going to allow the effects to kind of vary independently in those two zones. So that's kind of, again, a new angle that we're bringing to this research. The other difference is within these two geographic areas, property owners are going to have different access to insurance, which, again, is going to mediate some of the price effect that we're going to see. As I mentioned before, we're interested in these neighborhood characteristics that might mediate the response. And one important dimension is household income. Income is important because it's a good metric, we think, of the resources that the neighborhood and the households there might be able to bring to bear on recovery. But it also might be, if we're taking it at the start of this, or before this event happens, some signal of kind of faith in these markets, right, in these neighborhoods, expectations about recovery down the line. So we're going to use neighborhood income to get at some of that variation. And then lastly, the heterogeneity that might be useful to understand is the buyer response. So kind of a second order process that after there's some price response, do we see different kinds of buyers going into these markets or being able to access these markets, maybe due to discounted prices or other forms of barriers or discrimination that were more prevalent there before. Or maybe this is just about different kinds of risk tolerance. So certain kinds of buyers are going to just be more willing to take a lower price in exchange for some level of risk. So we're gonna try to understand if the composition of buyers shifts after the storm. We pulled together a bunch of data. I'm not going to go into much detail now due to time constraints, but we take information on the 100-year flood maps from FEMA, gives us a sense of the pre-storm risk exposure. Then we combine that with information on the actual surge heights, again from FEMA, that were documented after the storm, neighborhood income information from American Community Survey. Our property sales transactions come from the Department of Finance, and for the analysis here, I'm just focusing on 1 to 3 families. We have a host of characteristics that are attached to those properties, characteristics on the home buyers from the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, and then some permit application data to get at the nature, volume of repair after the storm from the Department of Buildings in New York City. So as I said before, a little bit more on these flood maps that we're using, again, to capture this pre-storm information about risk. This is one a representation of that, just to give you a sense of where the risky areas in New York City lie. This is Staten Island, Manhattan. I don't know, actually, if you could see my mouse here moving. Brooklyn is here in this southwest corner here, and then Queens is to the right. We combine this with information from the modeling task force out of FEMA on the actual surge heights, which we're going to use to proxy for actual damage to the properties. We differentiate between what we call high and low surge. We've played around with different cutoffs. Right now, we're saying at more than 2 feet of water, we're going to consider high surge, or areas that were hit really hard and prone to a higher level of damage. This is a rendering of that. The dark black area are the areas that had more than 2 feet of water in surge. The gray are between about 1/2 foot and 2 feet. And then the crosshatch is more than 0 height of water, but less than about 1/2 foot. And then the white areas that were not touched by any surge at all. So this is not the best representation of this, but we combine these two maps. And the important takeaway here is you'll see there's not a perfect overlap, right? There are areas that were designated as high risk from the flood maps, but got surged from the storm, and then areas that were not part of the flood map designation and saw levels of surge as well. So that kind of variation, that discrepancy is something we're going to exploit in our analysis to identify these local effects. So we're working off a standard hedonic model. The important thing to pull away from here is this post-Sandy dummy turns on after Sandy, takes place in late October in 2012. And then we interact that with a designation of the high and low surge to differentiate between these kind of severe and less severe flooding impact from the storm. The coefficient that we're really interested in, and actually it's not showing here clearly, is the one next to the high surge and the post-Sandy interaction. We think that's going to be our best estimate of the price effect from the storm due to flood-induced damage. Bunch of building, property level characteristics, fine geographic level controls as well. We then replicate this model for the home buyer outcomes. We're looking at the income and the racial identity of home buyers to see if that shifts after the storm. And it's a parallel kind of estimation strategy here where we're interested again in that high surge post-Sandy interaction, as we think is our kind of cleanest estimate of the effect from the storm on prices. Okay, so just to convince a little bit more of our identification strategy here and the variation that we're gonna exploit. This shows us a crosstab of being designated in the flood zone and then how much water was actually surged on these sales transactions. And you can see that most, large share, 75% of these transactions that were designated in the flood zone, and they were in fact severely flooded, more than 2 feet of water. And then likewise, those about 89%, 90% of those not in the flood zone saw no surge. But there's still a range of properties in between that were not designated as high risk, saw a surge, and vice versa. And it's those kind of in between cells that we're going to really exploit or leverage in our estimation. Okay, so I'm going to show you a series of charts now that summarize the results. And just to orient you, here I'm showing you annual effects on these prices. Instead of a single average effect from a dummy, we're just interacting annual yearly dummies to that high surge and low surge variable I showed you before. If the vertical line crosses that red line, which represents areas that were not surged at all, that means there's no significant difference from being, hit hard with a high surge and no surge. If there's a gap in between that line and the vertical lines, then that means a significant effect. And of course, the storm cloud is Hurricane Sandy. So we see here, this is citywide. So we see right away that after Sandy, there was a significant price discount. And for the areas that were hit hardest, that happened quickly and kind of persisted at about a 12% discount. The low surge kind of was more of a gradual decline, but we do see a reduction there as well in prices. The interesting thing here is when we divide up our sample, as I mentioned before, we're interested in understanding if kind of information about risk going into this makes a difference. We see for the sales that took place inside the FEMA zone, we basically see a quick drop in prices right after Sandy, but an immediate recovery. This persistent drop that we see citywide is largely driven by properties that reside outside the FEMA zone, suggesting that there was information about risk made more salient after the storm that is causing a reduction in prices and a persistence of that reduction. To dig into this a little bit more, as I mentioned before, we might think that the resources available to these households or to these neighborhoods more likely would help mitigate some of this effect. And we do see that here. So citywide, we see that the drop in prices is largely taking place among the lower income neighborhoods, the ones with higher incomes and maybe the more resources to rebuild, or with kind of a signal signal of kind of better resiliency to the broader market are bouncing back more after Hurricane Sandy. And then when we look outside the FEMA zone, the area where we saw the persistence of a price discount, that again holds true, that a lot of that discount is taking place in the neighborhoods that are lower income and for Sandy. So this is not an income response, it's due to Sandy, but this is kind of the status of the neighborhoods leading into the storm. So to kind of, again, further disentangle whether this is about, as I said, broader community resource, kind of wherewithal, expectations in the market, or is it about that those are the areas that also maybe had insurance to invest in rebuilding and propping the prices back up? So we actually see that, yes, outside FEMA, again, where we saw that the major discount, that the insurance seems like it is helping to reboot some of those prices. Again, not much of a change in the high inside FEMA, which is we weren't really seeing a price response there in the same way anyway. So this does suggest that the insurance is kind of counteracting some of that drop. The other thing we tried to understand is, again, was this about a physical rebuilding versus this recalibration of risk? So we pulled information on alteration permits. This is broadly inside the FEMA zone and outside. The data is a little noisy, but what we see is inside the FEMA zone, there's more movement, especially around 2016 when the Build It Back funds were dispersed around that time. So there was this influx of money, so that's not surprising. The timing actually doesn't help us much because we start to see a recovery before that inside the zone. Outside FEMA, the alteration permits are not really helping us to explain any recovery if there was any there. And again, when we disaggregate by low income and high income outside the FEMA zone, we're not seeing much of a difference. So this doesn't seem like any difference is due to differences in reinvestment as documented by these building permits. Okay, and I quickly just want to show you some results on the home buyer response. So we look at whether there was a change in income among the home buyers, and then I'll show you racial identity. And here we see that among the low income and high income neighborhoods, again, not distinguishing inside or outside FEMA, we actually don't see much of a shift in the income of the buyers that are going into these areas hit harder compared to before the storm. And then when we look outside FEMA, again, the area where we saw this bigger price discount, we actually aren't seeing much there either. In the high income areas, it does seem like there was some decrease in income, but it seems like that was there even before Sandy, so we can't necessarily attribute it to the storm. In terms of race, and this measures whether the likelihood that the home buyers are identifying as Black or Hispanic, we see that overall there is a trending up of that. So if anything, this is a kind of extension of a trend of the increasing likelihood that these home buyers do identify as Black or Hispanic in these harder hit areas, especially among the lower income neighborhoods. And this is, again, particularly true in the areas outside of the FEMA zone where we're seeing these more pronounced price discounts. So again, we haven't unearthed why, but it could be that maybe the price discounts open up these markets to some of these households. Maybe there's other things going on, like, retraction and some, discrimination that was present before, but there is some shift in the composition of these home buyers with respect to race. Okay, so in sum, the findings so far show us, first of all, that any effects on price, which are discounts in price, are really more persistent outside the flood zone. These are areas that probably did not have as much information about their exposure to risk going into it. So this might reflect some recalibration of that risk. Some of it's mitigated by insurance, which suggests that some of the discount might have been due explicitly to a physical disrepair that was capitalized into those prices. But it does suggest that some of it is about new risk salience. And again, we do see a shift in the kind of identity affinity of home buyers that are going into these harder hit areas with those price discounts. And overall, the effects, the discounts and price seem to be more pronounced in low income areas. So areas that might not have as many resources to rebuild, or might, again, be associated with there are other signals maybe coming out of those neighborhoods that suggest maybe less resiliency to buyers and the market more generally. So yeah, where we land right now is, I think, the evidence is pointing more towards this, recalibration of risk, new information about risk that's inducing price discounts rather than the physical damage mechanism. But we're still working on teasing that out. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you to all of the presenters for sharing your work with us today. So we have about 10 minutes left for questions. There are a couple in the Q&A box. I'll encourage any of the attendees, please send in your questions, but we'll start with a couple that we have here for Carolien's project. So Carolien, one of the attendees is asking, what are the racial implications of the buyout programs in the US? And are there data available about what communities usually apply for and receive this funding?
Yeah, thank you so much, Alexis, and also the audience member who posed that question. That's a very interesting question. And I already alluded to a little bit the structure of how especially FEMA-funded buyout programs work. Usually FEMA makes this money available after a disaster has struck in a specific area. This money is then funneled through the state, and local governments then apply to their state government for this funding in order to be able to do such a buyout project. And with a virtually similar co-author group, I've actually done research that was published last year in Science Advances, where we looked exactly at this question. And what we found there is actually that the jurisdictions that are slightly higher income and slightly have slightly fewer people of minority backgrounds are more likely to implement those buyout projects or like be administrators of those projects. But we also found that the locations where those buyouts, specific, like the houses that were bought out then took place, that those are most often in sort of the neighborhoods within those jurisdictions that then saw more, that have more people of minority backgrounds, such as different races or different ethnicities, and also lower income. And so that's a very interesting sort of paradox that we see over there, where you might expect buyouts maybe to take place more in places that have lower urban density, basically. We actually saw that the buyouts were more likely to take place also in places that have higher urban density. So race definitely plays a role there.
Great, thanks, Carolien. Rachel, we have a question for your presentation. Anna is asking, what percentage of the structures flooded during Hurricane Sandy had flood insurance? Do you think that the change in price outside the special flood hazard area will persist in the future, or will people forget about flood risk?
That's a good question. Inside the flood zone, it's a very high percentage that have insurance. I think it was 80 to 90%, of what we could capture. Outside the flood zone, it was a very small percentage of our sample. I think 10 to 20% at most. So we were surprised to see, even when we were bringing in insurance, some of the variation that we were able to observe. And actually, one of the questions that we had was, why were people buying insurance? Like, what information did they have access to kind of induce that? And so some of the presentations before, especially Carlos's, kind of inform. I'm interested to hear those survey results. So I think, I think we need to understand that more, actually, to understand the implications of this. And I think getting more information from this group outside the flood zone, that's buying insurance, I think is actually the group that you want to talk to right now in some ways, or go into those neighborhoods, because, you know, inside the flood zone, it's kind of clear, right? It's almost especially if you get a mortgage, like you have no choice. But outside, it's, you know, what decisions were these households making? And so I think that's important just to know, to understand the importance of these kind of the mandated regimes versus, are there other channels that in some ways might be, I don't know if it's more effective or could be more accessible or easier to get to than redrawing flood zones, or, you know, or I mean, that has other implications in and of itself. So I don't know if I know the answer, but I know that I think there are people out there we should be talking to that seem to have information that maybe we don't know about yet.
Great, thank you, Rachel. So I had a question for, I think it applies to a few of the presentations, and I know for sure that you're all aware of how important renters are. And this is something that I've encountered quite a bit in my own work. And I'm just curious, you know, where do renters fit into discussions about climate adaptation? And Carlos, in particular, I'm thinking about your results, and you noted how you had a much higher percentage of respondents who are white and higher income. And, you know, we know that New Orleans is looks a little different from that, you know, predominantly Black and also a high level of poverty. So what are we missing by not including renters, and how do we start to include them in these conversations?
Since you called me out, I'm happy to start that off. So I noted at the beginning of the survey that our population is of home buyers, and we have to purposely exclude renters, mainly because the questions that we're asking about risk information that occurs during the transaction process is not provided to renters. Louisiana is viewed as the gold standard of property disclosures, and renters aren't told anything. Renters are only told about the federal lead-based paint rule in the state of Louisiana, as they are in most places. So renters, that part of the study, renters were excluded from the survey components. But it's an ongoing problem, and I think the bigger issue that we face is affordable housing and multifamily housing restrictions. So there are numerous stories in the greater New Orleans area in the post-Katrina world of the outlying parishes prohibiting multifamily housing from being built. So you're not only the post-disaster, even if you've increased awareness of the general population, potentially even of the renters are still continuously screwed in this process. So I hate to say something so blanketly about all the renters, but in all 5 of our housing intervention areas, renters are at a disadvantage.
Yeah, I think that this is just, we know as housing researchers, this is a huge issue, and we have to, you know, continue to think of ways to incorporate them. So yeah, I really appreciate your response, Carlos. So Justin, maybe just to wrap us up here, I was really curious about your takeaway with the importance of flood driving migration rather than droughts, because I feel like there's this narrative around droughts being a major driver of climate migration. Were you surprised by this finding? Do you think that we need to be putting more attention to the influence of flood on climate migration?
Well, so I think that there are a couple of parts to this. That first, I don't want this to be taken as me saying that droughts are not a big deal and are not harmful, because they absolutely are. It's just that what we tend to see in Somalia and plenty of other contexts, instead of displacement in response to drought, is a variety of other survival strategies that are not long-term movement. So in some contexts, people might sell off various kinds of property in order to to ensure their own food security. There can be all kinds of activities that households could take that don't involve moving, there is some nice research out there showing that short-term movement can be a possible response to drought, whereas with flooding, there's kind of a much more kind of tangible, immediate need to just move somewhere else right away. Now, the other part of this is that I think that there's plenty of awareness that floods are an important driver of displacement, but there's some value to be added here that when we're considering the types of humanitarian aid to use in response to various kinds of water fluctuations, that we should not be on the lookout for displacement as much with drought as we should be with flooding.
That's great. Thank you so much for that insight. And thank you to all of our panelists. That concludes our session for today, and I hope that you enjoyed your time with us. So thank you all, and we'll see you later. Have a good night.